the lesson of the Torah portion. We begin today with the portion of Vayikrah. And I'm actually going to study from the Gutnik Chumash, which I cherish a lot. It brings a lot of commentaries that are very easy to understand. I will begin with reading a line or two from the text and explaining commentaries and interjecting the Rebbe's understanding of the commentary. So first we begin with the book of Vayikrah. We're starting this week a new book, the book of Leviticus, which is the third book of 5 books of Moses. What is so significant about this book? So there are many, some of which we'll delve in deeper. One of them is whenever we start teaching a child Torah, a Jewish child, may not necessarily be child in age, but just in their observancy, the first line we teach them from the Torah is the first line of the book of Leviticus. So when I celebrated the 3rd birthday of my children, we study with them Torah for the first time. We open up the book of Leviticus. That's the book that we start teaching children. There are other reasons, there are other uniqueness to this book, and here are some. I want to read to you 2 other explanations to what's so special about the book of Vayikra. The first is the Tosfot. Tosfot is a group of commentators that lived in the 6th century in France, and they write the following. Vayikra is the most difficult of the 5 books of Moshe. According to Tosfot, from the 5 books of Moses, the third, the middle one, Vayikra, although the smallest, the shortest in verses, chapters, and portions, and contain only 10 portions, yet it is the most difficult to comprehend from all the other books. The other explanation comes from the Medrash. The Medrash reads the following. In the account of creation, the word light is written 5 times, corresponding to the 5 books of Moshe. It says that if you go back to God's creating the universe, you find the word light 5 times. Each one of those 5 correspond to one of the 5 books of Moshe. And here they are. The first is God said, let there be light, corresponds to the book of Bereshit. That's the first time light appears. God said, let there be light. It's Bereshit, the book of Genesis, in which God busied himself creating the world. Let there be light is the first book. And there was light corresponds to the book of Exodus, in which the Jewish people came out from darkness to light. There was light corresponds to the second book where we read about the Jewish people Exodus from Egypt. That's why the book is called Exodus. The second book, God saw the light, that the light was good, corresponds to the book of Vayikrah. God saw the word good appears next to light, is in the 3rd time, corresponds to the book of Vayikrah, the book of Leviticus, which is filled with many laws. God separated the light from darkness, corresponds to the book of Bamidbar, Numbers, which separates between those who left Egypt and those who came to the land. At the book of the 4th book, we discuss and discover the generational gap between those who stayed in the desert and those who are about to enter the Holy Land. God called out the light and assigned it to the day corresponds to the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, which is filled with many laws. So the Medrash tells us that there are 5 times the word light appears in the creation of the universe. The 3rd time is God saw the light was good, corresponds to the book of Leviticus, which God calls it good. This book is called good. The Rebbe So here we have enough explanations about the uniqueness of this book. The Rebbe explains, I want to read what the Rebbe explains about how special the book of Vayikra is. The Rebbe says that the reason that this book is good, even though the book of Deuteronomy is also consists of many, many laws. However, as we discovered, that it's the most difficult book to study. And that means that in order for us to connect with God, we need to reach deeper into our comprehension and intelligence. And therefore, our level of connection to God is much deeper, far deeper than any of the 5 books. Says the Rebbe that that's why we call it the greatest book, or the book God saw the light was good, is because in order for us to actually delve into this book, we must use the faculty of intellect to a far greater degree than the other 4 books. I want to move on to the next topic. This entire book, not just the portion, is about sacrifices, different type of sacrifices. Hopefully we will have some time to discuss particular sacrifices, but I would like to discuss in general the purpose of sacrifices. This is a question that I face all the time. Why is there sacrifices, cruelty, animal cruelty, etc.? So first, let it be known that sacrifices is not necessarily animal sacrifices. Sacrifices can involve a handful of flour or a glass of oil and some wine. Also, the majority of sacrifices are done with animals, but the animals must be slaughtered properly without the pain or suffering, and only then part of the animal is brought on the altar as an offering. But what's the reason for it? What's the benefit? How does God benefit from sacrifices? So we have today, we're going to discover 5 reasons, and then we'll see what the Rebbe adds to the reasons of sacrifices. I am reading, if you have the book, from page 620, what is the reason of animal sacrifices? Again, I will read all 5, and then I will summarize all 5. The Ibn Ezra writes, even for fun to say that God actually needs animals to be burned, rather the significance here is mystical one. The Ibn Ezra says we don't know why. God has no direct benefit, and this is all mystical, spiritual, which we don't understand and have no clue as to the reason of sacrifices. That's the Ibn Ezra. Rambam Maimonides, he writes the following. At the time when the Torah was given, the Jewish people dwelled amongst non-Jewish nations who worshipped cattle and flocks. Therefore, God commanded the Jewish people to slaughter these animals, the deities of their non-Jewish neighbors, in order to rid the Jewish people of the idolaters' influence of the nations. Rambam says the Jewish people left Egypt. In Egypt, cattle, flocks was their deity. In order for the Jewish people to get rid of idol worshiping, he ordered them to slaughter animals for God's sake. That's how they get rid of sacrifices. So we have 2 reasons so far. Here is the 3rd reason, Nachmanides. Nachmanides first criticizes Rambam. Nachmanides lived shortly after Maimonides, and he writes the following. Rambam's assertion that God's mitzvot were given merely to wean the Jewish people off idolatry is utter nonsense. He says, how can Maimonides say such a thing? The Torah states explicitly that the sacrifices bring pleasure to God. It says, Reach nichoach laHashem, a pleasant aroma before God. It is not just to get rid of the idols for the Jewish people, because otherwise God would not call it Reach nichoach, a pleasant aroma. Furthermore, we find that Noah sacrificed animals to God when he came out of the ark, long before the Egyptian worshipped cattle and flocks, and this brought God tremendous pleasure to the extent that he decided never to destroy the world again. Nachmanides turned to Rambam and he says, how can you say that it is about getting rid of idol behavior when many, many centuries earlier Noah came out of the ark after the flood, and he brought a sacrifice to God. And we read that God had so much pleasure that he decided never to destroy the universe again. And therefore, by the way, for us, we have nothing to worry, because God have for sure created the cure for the ailment before the ailment come to the universe. It's just a matter of finding it, as God made a promise to Noah that the world will never get destroyed. So Nachmanides turned against Rambam. How can you tell us that it's about weaning the Jewish people of idol worshipping when sacrifices are all talked about Noah bringing sacrifices, and God is telling us that he had a great, great pleasure from it? Rather, this is Nachmanides, and it's a very important one because it's based on Kabbalah. A more acceptable explanation of the sacrifices is that in the process of sinning, whenever a person commits a sin, a person utilizes thought, speech, and action. Whenever someone is involved in disobeying God, all faculties, all three faculties, they are action, speech, and thought or emotions, are all involved with the act. Therefore, God decreed that atonement for his sin should also be threefold. Therefore, to atone for a sin, it must involve all three faculties of action, speech, and intellect or emotions. That's why first he places his hand on the animal, an action of atonement. Then he confesses verbally. That's
control
speech.
line on the bottom to show up.
Is there a problem? Is everything okay?
Rabbi, you might want to mute the other, well, the ones who aren't muted.
What?
You might want to mute the ones who are not muted. You've had a couple late arrivals who are not muted.
Oh. So mute all.
We were unmuted. He unmuted her.
All right. Can you hear me? Can you raise your hand if you hear me? Thank you. So Nachmanides says that the purpose of sacrifices is because when a man commits a sin, when a man misbehaves, he uses all his faculties, involves himself in the sin, and they are action, speech, and thought. Sacrifice involves all three faculties. Action, he must place his hand over the animal's head before the animal is sacrificed or is slaughtered.
No.
Speech, he must, just a minute. What am I allowing? Okay, now. So, in order for a person to atone for God, they need to do good in all the three faculties, placing their hands over the animal's head, speaking his speech is the confession of the sin, and thought and the faculties of desire is through the innards of the animal being burnt on the altar. Corresponding to person's thought and desires that led him to sin. That's what Nachmanides' explanation. So again, we have three. The Ibn Ezra says it is all mystical. We don't know why. Maimonides tells us it's all about weaning the Jewish people out of idol worshipping so they should worship God. Nachmanides, it is about atoning for sin, and sin involves all three faculties. In order for us to repent, we must involve all our faculties, and it can only be done through sacrifices. There is no other way to ask for forgiveness other than involving in a positive way all our three faculties. Here are two more. The Kuzari, sacrifices cause the divine presence to dwell among the Jewish people, like food, which causes the soul to continue dwelling in the body. Just as we cannot understand why the soul, which is spiritual, requires physical food to keep it attached to the body, likewise we cannot fathom why the divine presence requires physical food of animals on the altar in order to remain attached to the Jewish people. The Kuzari says that we have body and soul, physical and spiritual. They are two opposites, polar opposites, and yet we know when a person stops consuming food, the soul will depart the body. In order for the soul to stay in the body, they must continuously consume food. Even though food and soul, spirit, has nothing to do with each other, yet we don't know why. But that's the fact. That's the way life is. Says the Kuzari, in the universe, in order for us, the universe to exist, we must have the spirit of godliness in the universe. In order for the spiritual godliness to remain in the Jewish people and the universe, their food must be consumed by the altar, which is the sacrifices. How is it working? We don't know. Much less than we know about the food allowing my soul to remain in my body. Torasa Olah, so this is number 5. It says, mystically speaking, the sacrifice represents a unification with God. Thus, the word korban, sacrifice in Hebrew is korban, is etymologically related to the word kiruv, karov, come close, coming close, indicating that by offering a sacrifice, a person brings the attributes of his soul closer to God. The Torah Ta'olah, Torah Sa'oilo, it says that korban, sacrifice in Hebrew, korban, has also another meaning, which is closeness, which means when a person brings a sacrifice to God, he actually is coming closer to God. It brings God closer to the person. How is it being achieved? He does not explain, and we don't really know. So I'm going to summarize all 5 and then see what the Rebbe has to say. The purpose of sacrifices, according to the Ibn Ezra, is mystically, and we have no understanding. Maimonides tell us it's for winning the Jewish people that left Egypt out of idol worshipping, and therefore they needed to slaughter those animals. Nachmanides rebuked Maimonides, and he proves that Noah already brought sacrifices and God had great pleasure from, even though he never left Egypt. Therefore, Nachmanides writes that there are, when a man involved in sin, he is separating himself from God in all 3 faculties, and they are thought, speech, and action. Sacrifice involves action, speech, and thought, all 3 in the process of coming close to God. Then we have the last 2, the Kuzari, just like body and soul are united through consuming food, which is material and physical. We don't know how it works. So is God connected to the universe and the Jewish people. God representing spirituality and keeping the universe going, and the Jewish people and the universe, like the body, they need something connecting them, which is the sacrifice that the Jewish people bring. And finally, Torah Ta'olah says the word sacrifice in Hebrew is korban. It also means coming closer to God. When a person brings a sacrifice, he gets much closer to God. So far, we studied 5 explanations. Here is another explanation from the Rebbe. For the shortness of time, I will just go very quick. The Rebbe is asking us another question. From all sacrifices, the sacrifices that are most significant are the ones that atone for sin. If I told you that there are categories of sacrifices, and there is a sacrifice as a contribution out of the goodness of my heart, or a sacrifice in which God will wipe out anything I offended him, I am sure you can agree that the sacrifice that comes for atoning for sin is far greater than sacrifices that came out of the goodness of the heart of a person. Yet when the Torah wants to demonstrate the greatest of sacrifices, the Torah begins with sacrifice of nedava, of coming from a good heart. The sin offering sacrifice comes much later. Says the Rebbe why does the Torah chose to begin with sacrifice that deals with coming from the goodness of the heart rather than sacrifice that comes to atone for sin? And that can be explained by another question. According to Nachmanides, there are three conditions in which a sacrifice will atone. One is action, placing the hands over the animal, which is stated explicitly in the Torah. The second is confession, which the person must confess to God for his sin, which is stated explicitly. Yet the third part of the sacrifice, which is having my heart and desire to atone, is not mentioned anywhere in the Torah. If you look in the read, the study, if you study the details and the instructions of how to atone with sin, with sacrifices, you will find the instructions of placing your hands, action. You will find about confession, which is speech. You will not find about putting my mind and heart into desiring to ask for atonement. How come this part is totally omitted? Says the Rebbe, that can be explained with the first question. That's why the Torah begins with a sacrifice when a person brings out of the goodness of his heart. Because in that case, had he not desired deeply in his heart to do good, he would have not done that. Sacrifices that come to atone for sin are sacrifices that is required. It's mandatory. So then you can ask, do you really mean to ask for forgiveness? Do you really mean to come closer to God? The intention here is questionable. But when it comes to someone who comes to the temple and he says, I want to come closer to God, I would like to offer a sacrifice from the goodness of my heart without being required so, that means that there is no doubt about his intention. And that explains why the Torah begins in the book of Leviticus discussing the sacrifices of contribution or nedavah as opposed to chatat, sin offering, because in that sacrifice only you see without a doubt, there is no doubt that the person's heart and mindset is in the right place. And that's the reason, according to the Rebbe, the Torah chose this sacrifice. In other words, the Rebbe explains that those three faculties are why the sacrifice brings such pleasant aroma before God, because God shows us that He is giving us an opportunity to correct all parts of our action, speech, and thought, and not only one part or the other. Finally, it's already 7:30, so I would like to stop here and thank you all for participating and studying. I hope to continue and meet again next week. And all I want to wish is everyone to have a Shabbat Shalom, a good Shabbat. And hopefully that this coming week is, we just entered the month of Nisan. Nisan in Hebrew means miracle. And Nisan, Nes is miracle. Nisan is many miracles. May we all be happy to witness many, many miracles in these coming days for the entire universe, for our community and the people we know. I also would like to dedicate this study in honor of my in-laws. Both of them are not doing that great. They are both in the hospital. Unfortunately, my father-in-law, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch ben Sarah, and my mother-in-law, Golda Miriam Bat Fega Roisa. They should have a quick recovery without much suffering, should be able to return back to their life, and together with all those who need special help and cure. And thank you very much, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat.
Bye-bye.
Good to see you guys.